reading. The House now comes to questions for oral answer, and the first question stands in the name of the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Does he stand by his statement that dividends from state-owned enterprise energy companies help pay for services like doctors and hospitals? And can he confirm that the dividends earned last year from the four companies amounted to $732 million?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, yes, the government will spend in excess of $70 billion this year on a whole range of services, including doctors and hospitals. We'll fund this spending in a whole range of ways, including direct and indirect taxes, excise fees, SOE dividends, and through increasing debt. And to the second part of the member's question, yes.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker. Why is he intending to sell off shares in profitable companies whose profits remain entirely in New Zealand and are used to benefit all New Zealanders?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, because the government wants to acquire $33 billion worth of assets over the next 5 years, and it's the government's view that that's an efficient way of doing it. It's also the government's view that it will actually increase the performance of those said SOEs.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker, how much of the profits and dividends from Contact Energy, a company once wholly owned by New Zealanders, using the Clyde Dam, for example, built and paid for by New Zealanders, how much of those profits are now sent overseas to foreign investors, and is it in excess of $100 million a year?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know the answer to that question, but what I do know is that had Contact Energy not been sold, then that debt that was also from overseas would have had those dividends going overseas. Mr. Speaker, there is also a very important difference between, actually we owe a lot of money overseas. But, Mr. Speaker, the second most important issue, of course, is that there's a fundamental difference between Contact Energy and what the government's proposing under the mixed ownership model, and that is, at a minimum, 51% control would be held by the government. There's also 1.65 million KiwiSaver accounts. There's also the Crown financial institutions. There's also a wide range of other New Zealanders that would like to buy, so it's the government's view that the majority ownership would stay in New Zealand.
Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, when he told the House yesterday that Contact Energy was owned, quote, by a very wide range of Kiwi mums and dads, end quote, was he aware that in fact 80% of the shares in that company are owned by 1% of shareholders, mainly corporates, and most of the shares are now owned overseas?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, yes, and I apologise for rushing out the full answer. I didn't want to deter from the member being able to ask another question, but for the interests of making sure there's clarity, let me read out the whole quote. And it's from Patrick Smelly. It says, one of the least defensible criticisms of the key... Well, they don't want to actually hear it, but we'll go through it, Mr. Speaker. One of the least defensible criticisms of the key government's partial privatisation plans has been regular reference to Contact Energy as an example of a privatised company which lost control to foreigners. Quote, yet nothing could be further from the truth. The reality of Contact's share register is it remains possibly the most widely held share by domestic New Zealand investors. 11 years on from the float, in fact, Contact shareholders have shown a high degree of loyalty to the company, to the extent that EME's attempts to take 100% were roundly rebuffed in the early 2000s. What it shows is that many small-scale investors have piled into privatised companies like Contact precisely because they want to retain as much New Zealand ownership as possible. And if the member wants to ask me that question every day, I'll look forward to reading out the answer every day.
Chris Tremaine.
Supplementary question to the Prime Minister. Has he seen any policies on state-owned electricity company dividends?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I have seen at least two policies. The first is that we should hang on to these dividends at all costs because they raise hundreds of millions of dollars for the government's coffers. The second is from this statement to the Labour Party conference and goes, quote, that's something we got wrong in the last government. It's not right that last week a power company paid $230 million in dividends to government. We will not demand excessive dividends coming back to the state coffers. The confusing thing is that these two diametrically opposed policies come from the same person, the current Leader of the Opposition.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. Order. Order. I've called the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
How can the Prime Minister possibly be right in saying that Contact Energy is owned by a wide range of Kiwi mums and dads when most of the shares are owned offshore and when 80% of the shares are owned by 1% of the shareholders, the big corporates? How can he be possibly right?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, as I said earlier, Contact Energy was privatised in a completely different way than the proposals from the government. They are that there will be 51% control. They are that Kiwi mums and dads will be put at the top of the queue. They are to allow the 1.65 million Kiwi saver accounts an opportunity to invest. They are to make sure that the Crown financial institutes have an opportunity to invest. They are partly towards fulfilling the government's plan to have more Kiwi ownership in the form of the New Zealand Super Fund. Mr Speaker, there are big fundamental differences between that and Contact Energy, but if we want to go and look at privatisations that were hocked off in a very poor way, let's go and have a look when that member was a minister in the government.
Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker,
Order.
Is it correct, as reported, that Trustpower and Contact Energy, which are now privately owned, have increased their prices since 1998 by 180%, much higher than the rate at which the state-owned enterprises increased their prices? And how does he explain why the private companies have increased their prices by so much a higher rate?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I can't be sure of those facts because one never knows when they're presented by the member. But, Mr Speaker, what I do know...
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, as you'll be aware, that obviously reflects on the integrity of the question, or I can table the document that was reported in the paper that said that.
I think the member's point is well made, that the Minister doesn't need to, the Prime Minister doesn't need to answer the question that way, and it's always going to lead to disorder. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, I can't be sure of those facts. I certainly can't be sure that they are correct, nor have I ever seen them in the past. But I would make this point, and that is the bulk of those increases were under a Labor government.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, is he prepared personally to guarantee that if his sell-down of shares goes ahead as he has signalled, that that will not result in a much higher rate of price increases than would otherwise have occurred, and that significant shares in those companies won't end up very quickly offshore?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, firstly, it's important to understand that the majority share ownership will be held by the government. So that's the first point. Secondly, what controls the increase? What controls the increase in price is, of course, the regulation of the industry. And I'll make this point once more, that in the last 9 years of a Labor government, electricity prices rose 72%. I also make the point that about a week or so ago, there was a significant price hike, actually, in relation to hedges. And
Point of order, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, this is all very interesting, but I asked a specific question. Would he guarantee that the sale would not result in shares going offshore and prices rising much faster? He hasn't addressed that question yet.
Order. I think the member needs to just reflect a little on that point of order, that the Prime Minister is giving some explanation how the market works for electricity prices, and in answering a question about whether he can give an assurance prices won't increase, it's not within the Prime Minister's power to necessarily to do that. He's trying to explain to the House how the prices work in the electricity market, and that's a pretty sensible way to be answering such a question, I'd have thought. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
So if I reflect on what happened a couple of weekends ago, what we saw was a significant price hike. I make the point that is a matter for the Electricity Authority to investigate, and they are. But that price hike took place with three primary players, and that was Genesis, Mighty River and Meridian. They're all 100% owned SOEs. The prices in the regulatory sector, the prices in the electricity sector are controlled by regulation, not ownership.
Question number 2, Craig Foss.